Thank you very much. Ludger is my long-term co-author, and I appreciate the fact that he emphasizes my age when he when he does this. Uh, I'm actually going to talk about a number of things that Ludger and I have done together, so that if I have a health incident in the middle of this talk, Ludger can just continue on with my talk. I very much appreciate the opportunity to come here and talk about these topics. Thank you. I enjoy Munich very much and come here often from Stanford. Very seldom do I get full Stanford weather when I'm here, but I appreciate that for this event I was delivered with Stanford weather. What I want to talk about today is world development. We have seen over the last half century at least an effort by the US, by Germany, by the UK to promote development around the world. Much of this is with the idea that a developed world is a better, safer world. And the World Bank in particular is the institution that the developed countries have coalesced around to try to promote world development. In 2000, the World Bank had a set of development goals, the Millennium Development Goals. The Millennium Development Goals were where they wanted the world to be in 2015. And about 2013, as many people approaching the goals they've optimistically set in the past approached, they realized they weren't going to meet the Millennium Development Goals. And they developed a new set of goals that I want to talk about today, because while they didn't meet the prior development goals, they did become much more ambitious. So from 6 development goals in the Millennium Development Goals, they went to 17, which included as the first one, eliminating poverty in the world by 2030. Now this is obviously an ambitious goal. And many of the others are also ambitious, providing for nutrition for everybody in the world, healthy outcomes, equality in a variety of dimensions by income, gender, and various improvements in the environment to make the world sustainable. But what I'm going to assert is that 2 of these 17 goals are much more important in many ways than others, because it's impossible to think of the ambitious goals of eliminating poverty and improving the health in the world without having economic growth. Economic growth is the only way that provides the resources that permits all of these other laudatory goals. And what I'm going to talk about today is a second goal, number 4 of the list, and that is education. What I hope to tell you or convince you of very quickly is that economic growth does not occur without quality education. And that's the main point of what I'm going to talk about today, is quality education. Now, economists have been interested in economic growth and worked intensively on it for at least the last 25 years of trying to figure out why some nations grow faster than others. And there's been a lot of empirical work that compares and contrasts different countries of the world. Almost all of this work includes some measure of human capital, or the skills of the population that's involved. We're going to talk about human capital because in the talk, as I'm going to outline here, we start with how to measure human capital. How do you measure the skills of people in the world? And then I'm going to move on to a little bit of what is the value of more skills and try to bring home what it means to have a more skilled population. And then we get into the tricky business of, well, how do you improve the skills of people? What is it that you can do that would lead to improved cognitive skills or skills of the people? And finally, to talk a little bit about institutional structure of education that's important and might be something that could be transferred to other countries of the world. So that's the outline. Let me start with a simple story of how economists have approached this problem. They have generally taken measures of economic growth around the world, of countries around the world, and economic growth rates differ dramatically, and then try to relate those to characteristics of the countries that are involved. And in particular, they've spent a lot of time looking at education as a measure of, in fact, the skills of the population, the human capital. Well, I'm going to spend just a second talking about this, and I mentioned there's some work that I've done with Ludger that why he can stand up here and give the same talk at any point on how to measure human capital and its effect on growth. The starting point is a picture, and I'm going to do this through a series of pictures. So if you chose to sit in the back of the room, you have to have sharp eyes, because I'm going to show you some graphs of what happens in the world. Let me start with one that I'm going to repeat several times. It's a graph that has measures of years of schooling on the horizontal axis, and it has growth rates on the vertical axis. These are long-term growth rates covering the period 1960 to 2000. And what you see, oh, and it says conditional too, and I'll explain that in a minute. What you see in this graph is that countries that have more schooling tend to grow faster. That's the first thing you see. What you don't see, and that I'm going to try to explain to you, is that this graph is entirely wrong. So let me get to why this graph is entirely wrong. Let me explain conditional first. The only other thing that's taken into account in this statistical model that's behind this line that's drawn is the initial level of income in each country. So this is the 1960 level of GDP. This is growth rates in GDP per capita, or national income per capita. And why do you take into account initial GDP? Well, if I start behind, it's easier to grow fast, because all I have to do is copy what everybody else does. And if I start ahead, I have to invent new things, and invention is harder. So changing productivity is harder. But once you take that into account, you get this positive relationship. But there's some problems with this relationship. Let me pick out a few countries first that I've identified. The countries in black at the top comprise what I will call the East Asian miracle, because we see that Asia has grown much faster than you would expect based upon the measured skills of their population. But there's another problem with this picture. The other problem is what I would call the Latin American growth puzzle. Because if I went back to 1960 and I looked at the different regions of the world, I would have guessed that Latin America was going to be at the top, coming toward the top of the world by now. Why? Because they had more schooling than most other countries. In fact, they had much more schooling than East Asian countries in 1960. They had higher income levels and more development than East Asia in particular. And yet, if you'd predicted that in 1960, obviously you would have been terribly wrong, because their growth has not kept up. Now, what's behind all of this? Well, I think what's behind all of this is that measuring years of schooling is a very bad way to identify the skills of a population. Why? Well, nobody believes that a year of education in Brazil gives the same knowledge and learning as a year of education in Germany. But that's what's assumed by this picture, is that a year of education is a year of education, and that measures the skills. But there's an alternative that we have. The alternative we could use is to, in fact, find out what people know at different points in time, different levels of schooling or different ages. And how do we do that? Well, since the mid-1960s, there have been a series of international tests of math and science, where you think of it as taking a math problem and marching it around the world and seeing how many people can answer this problem in different countries. Okay, and so we've had these measures. Now, you all in Germany know this very well because of PISA. PISA is the current generation of these international tests, and there was the what many people refer to as the PISA shock in Germany of getting the results of the test in 2000, the first year that PISA was given, and finding out where Germany stood. But think of the following. I can take these international tests and use that as a measure of how cognitive skills differ around the world. When I do that, I get a different line. I get a different line. This is now, instead of conditional years of schooling, this is conditional test scores. Taking all of the test score measures I have, putting it together in the proverbial sausage machine, and I have this measure of quality of the labor force around the world, and against growth rates, again, conditional upon the starting income level. I have to take that into account. But once I do that, I get this different picture. Now, what's different about this? What's really different is that the countries are much closer to this line than they were to the previous one, and I'll demonstrate that in a minute. And that you get this very strong association between skills as measured by test scores and growth rates. What is not apparent, that I'm going to develop in a minute, is that that's a very, very steep line. It makes a big difference what the skills are of the people in each country. Now, let me quickly go back to the previous version that before we started measuring human capital here. I call this, by the way, knowledge capital, because I want to distinguish sharply from years of schooling. And economists tend to say, oh, years of schooling, that's human capital, as if that's a good measure. So we're using the phrase knowledge capital here. Here's the picture I showed you before of years of schooling against growth rates before I pay attention to what people learned in each year of schooling. Let me now pay attention to what people learned in each year of schooling. And what do I get? I get a perfectly flat line. That there's no relationship of just raw years of schooling once I know how much people have learned. And that's why that first graph was all wrong, because the real relationship is between the cognitive skills or the knowledge capital of different countries and growth rates. Okay. This is what I'm going to build upon here in a minute. But before I do that, I presume this is now standard in academic circles, and I presume in policy circles also, to ask the question, well, can we really believe that test scores, higher test scores, cause growth? In other words, if I find a way to increase the knowledge of the population, can I really expect growth rates to increase, or is it something else? Because we know that there are many differences across countries. It could be that countries that grow faster just are richer and they buy more of everything, so they buy more test scores, and so it's growth causes test scores as opposed to test scores cause growth, or learning causes growth. Or it could be lots of other things. I actually come here to Germany fairly frequently, but there are differences between the US and Germany in many, many dimensions. And I won't iterate all of the dimensions I see. You can iterate your own. We have Trump, you don't. But there's lots of omitted factors that could in fact be driving this relationship. There are cultural differences, there are differences in the regulations that apply. There's a whole series of things that might be confused with whether test scores are high or whether we observe higher learning that causes growth. So one of the reasons why the book that I identified with Ludger was 9 years late in being delivered. We had a contract to deliver the book and it wasn't delivered for 9 years. One of the reasons was that we had to convince the world, or at least our economist colleagues, that in fact you could plausibly argue that this is a causal relationship between knowledge and growth rates. So how do we do that? Well, let me give you just one approach. We have several approaches that we follow, but one approach is the following. I said we put all these test scores together, but actually if we look at different test scores, we see that there are some distinct patterns over time in how countries have evolved in their testing. Because these are countries that basically took tests at the beginning, in the 1960s or 1970s, and also at the end. So for this set of countries, we just draw a straight line between their test scores, and I've demonstrated them there. Some of them, we have Japan and Korea that are at the top, but they haven't changed very much. They're pretty flat. We have Germany that until 2000 was falling a little bit. There's been a recovery, but falling. We have the European hero, Finland, which shows these rapid increases in performance. And nobody has ever, except one time when I was in Italy, objected to the observation that here's Italy that's low and falling in terms of these tests. Now, if you look at this diagram, what it says is that countries that have steep upward rises should also see that their growth rates are increasing, that over time they tend toward a faster growth than countries that are flat, where there's no change. Their growth rates ought to be flat, there's no change, or are falling, their growth rates ought to be falling. So I can do the same kind of thing with individual yearly growth rates. So I go to each country, I take the annual growth rates for each country, and I draw a straight line through them. Now what I should see is that straight line I draw through growth rates should be steeper for countries that have steeper improvements in performance, and maybe even falling down if there's if performance like Italy's is going down. And so what do I see? Here's the picture where the horizontal axis, the trend in test scores, is just how steep is the test score line, and the vertical axis is how steep is this line I drew through each country's growth rates. And what you see is that every country falls in the correct quadrant. Countries that have shown that their test scores are increasing have shown that their growth rates are also increasing. And you get down to, here's Italy, but here's also Japan. That's had low growth rates. It's been sort of flat and it stays there. Even though the scores are high, its growth rate hasn't changed. Maybe even has fallen some. So this is just if we wanted to quibble, we could quibble with this diagram, and I'll tell you how you can quibble about it over a glass of wine, I'll tell you. But it's hard, of course, to be conclusive and show that, in fact, there's this causal relationship. On the other hand, there is a lot of evidence that you can compile that is suggestive that countries that improve their performance in education can expect to get faster growth. I'm going to move on to value this, but if there's any pressing questions, I can answer them at this, because we're going to change gears a little bit. I'm going to take that picture I showed you and assume it's real. Assume that this is reality. And what I'm going to do is use that picture of reality to forecast what would happen if we had some improvements in performance of learning, that schools get better, that knowledge goes up, and what we could expect. So I'm not going to spend much time on individuals. There's some other work another co-author, Zeman, is in the front row for, that has looked at the fact that individuals that know more earn more, very simply. And I think most parents believe this, and most individuals believe it, that if you know more, you should be rewarded for that, and it's true. And it's true across countries in very predictable ways. What I want to do is spend more of time looking at growth rates and what differences in performance mean for growth. So what I'm going to do is estimate the value of school reform, and this is actually based upon a study that Ludger Wussmann and I did for the OECD. This was done right before the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations were going to be developed. And it was an attempt to try to convince them that they ought to pay more attention to quality of schools in a very specific kind of way. But in this, we did the following. We just assume that history, the historical growth patterns from 1960 to 2000 that we looked at, continue into the future, and way into the future, longer than anybody would actually want to believe, but we look at 80-year periods into the future. Why 80 years? It's somewhat arbitrary, but it really identifies the life expectancy of somebody born today. They're going to live for 80 years. So we just use that as a way to pin down what the value of growth is. And we're going to assume that history repeats itself for 80 years. That, among other things, means there's no major wars and all the other things, that countries stay around. And what we're going to do is look at a very simple idea, and that is that all citizens in the world get what we're going to call basic skills. Now, if you looked at the PISA test, almost everybody looks at just the average score of Germany on PISA versus the US versus Finland and so forth. But what PISA also does is identify different levels of knowledge. And the basic level of knowledge in mathematics basically says if you give somebody a simple problem with all the facts in hand, they can solve it. So a good example would be the following. I flew here from California. I paid $2,500 for my ticket. The exchange rate between the dollar and the euro is 1 to 1.2. How much did my ticket cost in euros? Not a very stretched problem, right? It's a fairly straightforward problem. When that problem is, or problems like that are given to 15-year-olds, 16% of German 15-year-olds cannot reliably solve that problem. What we're going to look at is what happens if we bring the people in every country up to being able to solve that. 23% of US students can't reliably solve that problem either, I should say. But what I'm going to do is try to show you what it would mean if, in fact, all 15-year-olds got the level of knowledge indicated by that, this basic skill level. Now, for some countries, if I looked at Ghana, less than 10% of 15-year-olds can solve that problem. Or actually, let me qualify that. Less than 10% of the 15-year-olds who are currently in school can solve that problem. But there's another almost 30% of students in Ghana that aren't in school at age 15. So obviously for Ghana, this is not something that's going to be easily done. But that's what I'm going to do, is sort of talk about what it would mean if, in fact, everybody got to that level. Okay? I'm actually going to do 3 different estimates. What I'm going to do is say, well, first, this is time on the horizontal axis, and this is how much larger is GDP at any point in time. And what this black line is countries are going to grow with their current education level. Germany is going to grow if nothing changes. And probably a reasonable estimate is that GDP per capita will increase by 1.5% per year. And this is the picture you'd get from, in fact, a 1.5% growth rate in per capita GDP over the next 80 years. Okay? But what I've been telling you and what I want to show you is that if we improved the knowledge capital of nations, we add to the skill levels, bring everybody up to solving that level 1 problem or something like it, we could actually get faster growth. Okay, now it takes some time before you see that, right? Why? Well, if I'm going to improve the schools, I have to do that somehow, probably by changing the teachers in the schools or something like that. And that's going to take time before I can actually get everybody up to that level in schools. And then what happens? Well, I mean, what would happen if I could instantly change the quality of schools today? So all of a sudden tomorrow I go out and I see that all German 15-year-olds can reliably solve exchange rate problems and problems like that. What would happen to the economy then? Well, nothing. They're still in school. We have to wait till these kids get out of school. And then as they become more and more important in the labor market, these higher quality kids, that's when you start getting this divergence and start seeing the results. So the one thing I'll say at the beginning that often doesn't enter into the public debates is that you have to have some persistence in your policies, because you're not going to see the results instantly of any policy. You have to have some patience, but when you have patience, you'll see that this is very important to the future of the German economy. For example, in Germany, as is starting to become the case in the US, the future for us older people that are going to retire depends upon having economic growth that can support the retirement system. And that's something that takes time to develop over this. What I'm going to do is give you the following results. I'm going to give you how much difference is there in GDP from getting faster growth that comes with better schooling compared to what I would get if nothing happened. And what I'm going to assert is that you get some fairly big numbers out of that. Now, obviously, I should just say in the background, I'm going to compare GDP all the way out in the future. And remember that lots of these things happen out in 2090. And some of us in this room may not have that big of an interest in what happens in 2090. Okay, so what I'm going to do is weight things close to today more heavily than those far in the future. I'm going to discount these in formal terms, just like I had, and I'm going to end up at various times talking about what size bank account would I have to give me that difference. But for the most part, I'm just going to compare, on average, how much higher is that red line than that black line? On average, what percentage increase do I get? And I'm going to do it in three ways. I have, in the book that talked about with Ludger, we've looked at 76 countries of the world. These 76 countries of the world aren't random because they are the countries that took tests in the past, so I know what the quality of their labor force is. And I'm going to project out three different situations. One is I'm going to say, let's just take the kids that are currently in school at age 15 and improve the quality of their schools. Don't pay attention to those that aren't in school. Just ignore them and just look at what would happen if I improved the quality of the existing schools. Secondly, I'm going to look at the alternative of what would happen if I made sure there was a school for everybody, but at the current quality levels of schools. This is what the original Millennium Development Goals in 2000 really looked at. They said, let's make sure that everybody completes lower secondary schooling without any consideration of quality. And the argument is simple. You know, your kids probably aren't going to learn if they aren't in school. So this sounded like an equitable way to do this. But what you got after 2000 was a dramatic increase in the numbers of kids that were in school in many developing countries, and no indication that they learned anything. Okay. So I'm going to contrast these two different things, and then look at the ultimate of what would happen if we could get everybody in school in each country at age 15 into school at a higher quality level, so that they at least could solve my exchange rate problem. Okay? So here's the answer that you get in terms of how different is that red line from that black line. I'm going to divide countries, by the way, in using World Bank criteria by income level. So I look at lower middle income countries here, which include such countries as Ghana, Honduras, Indonesia, and Morocco. They're pretty low income countries. And what you see is that if all of these kids at age 15 could get up to the basic skill level, you would get something like, on average, that red line is 13% higher than the black line. 13% is a pretty big number for GDP on average for essentially the rest of this century. Okay. Now you get something less when I go to other countries. Again, these are World Bank distinctions. Upper middle income countries, you get up to Argentina, Bulgaria, South Africa, Turkey, maybe before Erdogan in Turkey, but high income countries, you get Hong Kong, Lithuania, and a series of Arab oil countries, of Oman and Saudi and others. And then the last bar there is for the high-income OECD countries, Germany, the US, and all of Europe, essentially. And what you see here is that there's less impact. You only get 10% increase in on average for these lower or upper middle income countries. But you even get improvements in Germany, as we talked about, where Germany has 16% of the students not able to solve those problems, even though they're in school. For Germany, the answer would be a little over 2%, 2.3% estimated increase of the difference on average of the red and black line for GDP in the future. For the US, you get 3.4% with our 23% that are out of school. I mean, not learning. But this is what happens when we ignore who's in school. Now let's go to the opposite extreme. Let's put everybody in all of my 76 countries into school at the current quality levels of the schools in each of these countries. And what you get here is now something like 4% higher average growth rate in the poorest countries of my graph instead of 13%. You get essentially nothing in the high-income OECD countries because everybody at age 15 is really in school. There's only a few that aren't. So there's no gain there from just access. And you get less amounts. And then finally, to give you some idea here, let's put them all together. And all of a sudden, we're getting 28% higher average income on that red line versus black line for the poorer countries in our sample here, for the low middle income countries. Okay, and you get 3.5%, the same 3.5% essentially that you had there, but this is what is in some sense the answer to the Sustainable Development Goals. This says if you provide the cognitive skills, the knowledge capital to countries around the world, you could actually think of solving the development problem that we have not been able to solve very well in using the methods we've been doing so far. So this is the answer of how steep that line is also. Now the other thing to notice is that when I gave you that list of countries, there are no low-income countries on there. We have 76 countries, but there are close to 200 countries that are in the United Nations. And on average, they're going to be lower in skills than those that at least participate in these tests. So if we add in, and also China and India aren't included here, but there's kind of special cases because in China, maybe more people there can solve that exchange rate problem than in the US. Probably not true, but there in parts of China that's clearly the case. And India has poorer education, but they're still not down at the bottom. But what would happen if we did this? The results would be, in terms of the present value, in terms of the total value of the future gains, it'll be 5 times the current GDP of the world. Okay, and that would be spread out across countries in various ways. But compared to, this is the same as the bar graphs before. If I brought everybody up to basic skill level, the world GDP on average would be 6% higher everywhere in the world if everybody got up to that. Obviously more in low-income countries, much higher, and less in the developed countries that I've already shown you, 3%. You get much less You only get a 2.5% improvement on average for the whole world. This is averaging all 190, 200 countries of the world together. And then finally, if we got everybody up to full access in these skills, what we call universal basic skills, world GDP would be 11% higher on average than we see with no improvement. Okay. This is, to me, what economic development means, and it gives you a chance to deal with some of the poverty problems, some of the health problems, some of the nutrition problems that we see around the world. Well, now you say, maybe you say, how do we do this? And that's the problem. How do we actually improve cognitive skills? What do we know about this? This is just a picture of how PISA scores, or going back to the earlier, before PISA scores, have evolved for different countries of the world. And what you see is that some countries, like Finland, have gone up, but then they've fallen off a little bit in recent years. Other countries, the United States and Germany here's the close to the PISA shock. It started going up. And then you see Sweden, which comes out here and then falls off a cliff. Okay. Now, what I assert is that none of these countries, particularly the ones that have declined, planned to decline. None of them desired to go down. So what we've seen is there aren't any simple answers. There are no simple answers that all of a sudden I can solve the learning problem in schools in Germany or around the world. There are pieces, there are some answers, there are pieces to the puzzle that we know, but they're going to take consistent policy actions around the world. So what's behind these? Well, we know that family background makes a big difference every place. But that's not something that we know how to change very easily, right? We don't know how to improve the way parents educate their kids. But it's important. And we also think that school inputs are important. Although there's no simple answer, even if some of our development agencies think there are simple answers. In particular, if we look at just expenditure, which is the normal tool. The normal tool is, let's take some money, give it to the countries to buy better schools, and see what happens. Well, if I see what happens, this is mainly developed countries, OECD countries, and I have increases in expenditures per student against increases in PISA scores. And what do you see? Well, I'd probably get a positive line through there if I paid attention to Poland, although it's not clear that Poland drives the world. But basically, there's a cloud. We aren't seeing that countries that just put more money in necessarily get improvements. Nor do we see that countries that don't put money in don't get improvements. We see everything in this picture because there's no essential relationship to just providing more resources. And that's the puzzle that your development agency faces, that my development agency faces, and the World Bank faces, is that you have to think of other things than just providing more money. There's a large organization now that's headed by Gordon Brown, the former Prime Minister of the UK, that has essentially argued that, well, we just need more money and we're going to solve this development problem. But I think that this picture says it pretty clearly that that's not going to be the simple solution. It may be part of the solution, but it's not the simple solution. So the same holds in the introduction. Ludger mentioned that at some point in the past, I started talking about how reducing class size didn't necessarily lead to more achievement. Most of the scar tissue has healed since then, but obviously people weren't very pleased with that as a story and resisted that, but I think it's true. The one thing that we have learned, and this is largely from data within a few, largely with US data, but it's now expanding quite broadly around the world to information that suggests that teacher quality is a key ingredient. That some teachers are better than others at teaching. Now, no surprise to either parents in the room or students in the room that there really is a difference among teachers in how well they do. What do we know about that? Well, here's US data. I'm going to go to the US for a moment. And what I'm going to do is, we know a lot about the range of effectiveness of teachers. And we know this in the following way. In the United States, in almost every state now, we can look at a classroom in, say, grade 4 in the US, and we can look at the students that went into that class because we've given them tests in grade 3, so we know how good they are going into grade 3. Then we look at how much had they learned at the end of grade 3 to the end of grade 4. And if I assign those gains to teachers, differences in learning across classrooms, I can get a measure of how different are teachers. So in other words, I look at, in 1971, as pointed out by Ludger, I once started looking at, can you see big differences in the average learning across classrooms? And in fact, you do. You see huge differences in learning. We know how wide that distribution is, so that if I ranked all the teachers in the United States and I could identify how much more would you learn with a 75th percentile teacher, a pretty good teacher, compared to an average teacher. And then I can say, well, if you learn that much more with this good teacher, what is the value in terms of future income to these students? And we actually know a fair amount about that too, of how much more you earn if you know more. And I'm just going to put those two things together. And I'm going to show you, this is the picture of that. What this picture says, there's a line on this picture, and you have to pay attention to class size, because a good teacher with one student is not as important as a good teacher with 25 students. Because a good teacher with 25 students does this magic for everybody in the class. Okay? And this is the picture of how much more income over the lifetime, again, discounting long in the future and so forth, how much income could you expect the students in that class to have compared to an average teacher? And the answer is, for this is a 75th percentile teacher that I've drawn here. The answer for a class of 30 is $400,000 for a teacher when the average salary of teachers is about $60,000. So this good teacher is in fact generating $400,000 added income for her class compared to an average teacher. Okay. Now, you probably are looking at this graph and sort of saying, why is there all this open space at the bottom? And in fact, here's what a 10th percentile teacher looks like. She is one that you remember when you had that 10th percentile teacher. And what is that teacher doing? That teacher is subtracting $800,000 each year compared to an average teacher. What is this statement about? This is a statement that says paying attention to the quality of teachers is worth a lot because it makes a huge difference in terms of what students learn. And what students learn makes a huge difference in how productive they are when they leave school and go out into the labor force. That's the interpretation of this. Now, you all say, yes, I know, but remember, we can't get rid of bad teachers and so forth. And that's the trick, of course, is that every country in the world has strong teachers' unions. Every country in the world has regulations that protect the teachers. They don't necessarily protect the students, but they protect the teachers. So part of the trick in all of this is thinking about how can you design systems that will ensure that you have good, high-quality teachers and that you aren't necessarily burdened with the low-quality teachers. Now let me give you one other sort of explanation about how important teachers are. And this is an experiment that I want you to mentally think about. I'll put it in terms of the US, but I think I could also put it in terms of Germany. In the US, there are 4 million teachers in the whole country. Think of lining up these 400 million teachers according to how good they are, how effective they are at learning in the classroom. Now do an experiment where you say, well, let's take the worst teacher that I can find out of 4 million and replace her with an average teacher. Or let me take the bottom 1% or 2% of the poorest teachers and replace them with a bottom teacher. What does the evidence say about what that would do to achievement? And so this is in US terms, given how different there are teachers. And here's the answer. Here's the percent deselected means what percentage of teachers are replaced with an average teacher. And this is an estimate of the effect on test scores. The answer here is that in terms of the pictures of growth, if I could replace the bottom 5% of teachers with an average teacher, I could, according to history, expect 0.5% per year faster growth. 0.5% a year. If you don't normally deal with these numbers, you think 0.5% is a small number. If you deal with these numbers, you know that 0.5% is a huge number in terms of long-term growth and the economic impacts that you would see from that. So that's the story about teacher quality. Let me talk about what are the characteristics of teacher quality. We have trouble measuring what a good teacher is. We know the following from all the evidence in the US and around most other countries, that knowing how experienced the teacher is gives you no information about how good they are in the classroom. Or, at least in the US and I think in other places, knowing how much education the teacher has doesn't tell you anything about how effective they are in the classroom. So our usual measures of quality don't really hold. They don't stand up against the evidence. Now, the other work that I mentioned that Simon and I have worked on is that we can now actually measure the cognitive skills of teachers in different countries, for about 30 countries, a little over 30 countries. And so what this is giving a test to teachers and to non-teachers and finding out where each country chooses to hire its teachers from. Okay? What we see here is that these are just an arbitrary score of numeracy skills, and here's some different countries. The gray bar here represents the range of math skills of the 25th to the 75th percentile of, 25th to 75th percentile of college graduates in each country. And the red bar indicates where countries choose to hire their teachers from. So what you see at the top is Finland, which has a good pool to draw from. The college graduates in Finland are very smart, and then on top of that, it chooses to draw its teachers from high up, the average teacher from high up in this good distribution. As opposed to, well, here's Poland down here. Poland has a worse pool and no self-respecting college graduate Pole would go into teaching. It's all down at the bottom. Now it turns out, it's not everything, but it turns out, as a simple answer, having smarter teachers is better than having dumber teachers. And in fact, it comes through. But before I get to that, let me show you, this is all the countries that we have, from Chile at the bottom to Finland at the top. And Germany does pretty well in terms of the quality of its teachers. Germany chooses above the median of the college graduates for teaching, and it's a pretty good pool to draw from. So in fact, there's something to think that Germany is doing something right there. Here's what happens if you compare the numeracy skills of the teachers of a country against the math scores of the students. And what you see is, it pays to have teachers that are smarter than teachers that are dumb. And in fact, you get Deutschland up near the top. Okay. So that's not everything. Since I've kept your attention for a long time, I'll just run through a couple ideas here, and then over wine we can talk about details. How do you get those teachers? Well, partly you might pay them. And in fact, what you can do is compare how well are teachers paid compared to everybody else in the economy, given the skills that they have, given how smart they are, and their experience levels. And what you see is countries do behave very differently. This is the premium. So if you went to Ireland, teachers are paid 45% more on average than everybody else in the economy. Teachers in the US and Sweden are down here where we pay our teachers 20% less than comparable people in the economy. And here's Germany is paying a premium to teachers, and it shows up, in fact, of drawing teachers from higher up in the skill distribution, which in turn helps the schools in Germany. Now, I'm just going to list these so that I know I'm standing in the middle of, in between questions and then in between questions and wine. So let me just race through what we know internationally about some of the answers. The international evidence speaks to what kinds of institutions you can provide to schools that provide incentives to get good people into the classroom and keep them there. One is having a good accountability system, measuring what the students know and what they're learning, and using that to feed back into school decisions is useful. So in other words, sort of normal management kinds of things. You look at whether the schools are performing or not, and you try to reward the ones that are performing and not the ones that aren't. If you can measure the performance of students, then it turns out that it pays to let the teachers and principals in different schools make a lot of decisions. The people in the schools know more about what their capacities are, and they know more about what their demands are. And you want to let them make decisions if you can observe what they're doing. If you can't observe what they're doing, it becomes a little bit more questionable, because they might use their local decision making to do things that weren't in the interest of student learning. But if you have a good accountability system, then it makes sense. Economists frequently go to a simple answer, and that is you should reward good performance and not bad performance. Although that's hard to do, and not many countries do it very extensively. But rewarding the people that are doing a good job pays off in private enterprise, and it turns out that if it's done in the schools, pays off in the schools too. And then having a little competition always helps. This is where we get into the private industry part of the talk. A little competition pushes people to do better. And if you have competition in the schools, in other words, if parents have more choice over where their kids can go as opposed to being assigned to a specific school and no choice, that turns out to help. Nothing is a complete win. Nothing solves all the problems. But these are what we've learned from looking across the world at the kinds of systems that have positive impacts on student learning. And then there's a lot of discussion, which I think you know somewhat, is that better early childhood education pays off too, of a different variety. It particularly pays off for low income, low socioeconomic status, disadvantaged students, that providing better early education prepares them for schools and helps them to catch up. So what do I conclude? My answer is very simple. Development equals growth, and growth equals skills. That's the simple story. To me, the numbers that I gave you on what happens to the economy or what happens to individuals from better learning, more cognitive skills, higher knowledge capital, is just overwhelming. That we should be willing to attempt more difficult kinds of changes in policies because the value is so high. So I have these debates in the United States with people. I sort of say, well, there's a big value in improving our schools, and the standard answer is, oh, we know that, but it's so hard. And the answer here is that a lot of at least economic development and future income is being left on the table if you just stop with the "it's so hard" statement. We have seen, as we look around at various countries, including some of the performance in Germany, that improvement is possible. But it takes a continued commitment. You can't just do something today and then do something different tomorrow and hope that everything works out. We found that that doesn't work. Thank you. Thanks.